good morning to those of you who are still in the morning time zone for joining us for this panel conversation on reimagining and re-envisioning policing. We have quite the panel this morning, and we hope to have quite the robust conversation as well. I think it's equally important that we are having this conversation, especially now post-election. We're going to get into that a little bit as well. We only have a short time together, so I'm sure it's going to use up pretty fast. Let me please introduce real quickly who our panelists are. First, Leslie Redmond. Wave, Leslie. There you are. Is sought after public speaker, civil rights advocate, and entrepreneur. Leslie is a Washington, D.C. native, and at the age of 25, she became the youngest president of the Minneapolis NAACP. She is also the founder and CEO of the Don't Complain, Activate brand. Oh my goodness. Her clothing line launches November 24th on leslieredmond.com. Leslie received her Juris Doctorate and Master's in Business Administration from the University of St. Thomas. And we will look for the clothes drop, and you're going to talk all about that as well. So I got you. Jamael Lundy, he'll pop on here just a minute. We've got that gorgeous picture. Committee Administrator for the Public Safety and Criminal Justice Reform Committee of the Minnesota House of Representatives, a community organizer, political staffer, a law student who's always looking for a way to work to make a better world. So we are definitely appreciating the voice. John Harrington was appointed commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Public Safety by the governor in 1977. I should say commissioner, began at the St. Paul Police Department as a patrol officer, working his way up the chain of command, and he was selected chief of police in 2004. He served into that role until 2010. And it's my understanding you continue to be that voice in Minnesota around law enforcement and how we can reimagine that work. I am Dr. Tracie Keesee, and I am the co-founder of the Center for Policing Equity. My role is Senior Vice President of Justice Initiatives. So I'm absolutely pleased to be here to have this conversation. We all are very aware of the events of this past summer and the homicide of Mr. Floyd and those things that subsequently occur after and continue in a lot of our country, or a lot of our states throughout the country, including in Minnesota, and that is really raising voices, demonstrating in regards to the type of public safety that community wants and deserves to have from the folks that are providing that service. I want to start with a probably really general question, and we'll just do a round robin on this, because one of the things that we're finding is the word reimagine seems to be defined in many different ways. Whether you believe in defunding or abolitionism, what is happening in this space now? And I'm asking the question, what does that mean? What does it mean to reimagine public safety? And Leslie, I'm going to start with you.
And thanks so much. So when I think about reimagining public safety, we know that the policing system in America was really built on the backs of Black people, right? Indigenous people, slave patrols, right? It is hard when we talk about fixing a system that isn't broke. And so when people say reimagining, I think about transformation, right? I think about taking something that was not meant for our good and making it for our good. I think Chief Arredondo of the Minneapolis Police Department does a tremendous job of this, right? Actually looking at policy, procedure, how we're moving about things to recognize the history, but also recognize that we need to be able to move forward together in a meaningful way. And that communities, we do have issues, and a lot of the issues, the root of them is poverty, right? And not the people. And so when I think about it, it's about, policing for white people means something different than policing for Black people. For white people, it's protecting and serving. And for Black people, a lot of the time it's over policing, it's brutality, it's murder. And so how do we transform this system to work for everyone?
Thank you for that. And we're going to pick up on some of those nuggets you just dropped and as we go around. John, again, what does that mean to reimagine policing?
Well, I appreciate both Leslie's opening comments and your framing this, because I really do think it is time for us to start really looking at this from a perspective of what is the possible rather than what is the practical. And quite frankly, having worked in this field for now 40 some odd years, what is the affordable, which is usually what drives the conversation, quite frankly. I've had lots of those conversations with mayors and governors and other folks about what could we do, even trying to go back to the original premise of policing out of Sir Robert Peel. But oftentimes it has been blocked by either, well, that doesn't seem practical, or it doesn't seem to be affordable. And the example I used over the course of 2019, A.G. Ellison and I started a working group to look at deadly force encounters. What it turns out is that most of the work we did ended up being about police reform, even though that wasn't the topic. One of those sidebars to that was going out to Camden, New Jersey to look at how they had reimagined policing there. And I was amazed to see a department that really literally shut down one agency and picked up another agency with an entirely different vision and an entirely different mission of what policing could be. And with that, they saw use of force drop, they saw crime drop. There really was a possibility there that's now evidence-based and practiced, and has now several years of history that we can look to say, this isn't just possible, it's been done.
Thank you for that too, because there's still a lot of that conversation in the air that whether or not it can truly be done. Jamael, you're smiling at me and you're typing, and I have the question. Every time you type, we see your fingers. That's all we see. But but same question for you, right? What does it mean to reimagine?
Yes, for me, it simply means questioning underlying assumptions. Where you're looking at, as Chief Harrington, Commissioner Harrington spoke about, looking at underlying assumptions about what we're doing and how effective it is in actually preventing crime for areas that are under-policed. Looking at the accountability of policing for areas that are over-policed, and then generally looking at the structure of policing and the community and how they interrelate, how there are avenues for recourse and improvement and policy change. For me, and at least my work both with under the president, Leslie Redmond at NAACP, but also as a working the legislature, at least as staff, that's what I've seen as a consensus among members, is looking at how exactly we could change policing in a way that isn't essentially tinkering around the edges, but looking at a fundamental transformation and questioning of some fundamental tenets. I'm hopeful we can get into some of those, because I'm sure I've got plenty of examples. So
yeah, and let's do that, right? Because I can just tell you from the work that I'm doing, I hear a lot of these sort of pronouncements that we don't want police, and I think we've seen folks who've gone through that, and even there in Minneapolis, let's defund and shut it down, to figure out that it's not that easy. And not just that it's not that easy, it is, you still have folks who are victims, you still have crime, and you can't just sort of turn and say, well, shrug my shoulders, collateral damage, we'll figure that out. Most communities are not going to stand for that. So let's talk about that. What does that mean? Because I think the other thing, and we'll get into that as well, is funding, right? So as we talk about divest, as we talk about abolish, what we're also finding as we do some of our work is that community is not necessarily familiar with how governance works, and that you're not going to sort of get that money, and you won't get it tomorrow. It may be 2 or 3 years from now, based on whatever the fiscal rules on how those things are. So while I still have you, let's talk about that. What does that look like? Jamael, what does that look like when you say, let's sort of challenge the assumptions and figure out public safety? Because I'm getting a sense, and I'll stop and let you speak, is that we're asking community to do something in a sort of truncated time period that took centuries to get to. And I think it's an unfair ask. So I'll stop there. Go ahead, sir.
So there are multiple different avenues here. So the one that I particularly work on has to do with regulatory reform. I tend to think that a lot of the change that folks would like to see in policing can come from state level regulatory agencies. Even the International Association of Chiefs of Police and others have indicated that there is, Congress has indicated that the regulatory body has a whole lot of teeth. So to get into specifics, one frame I like to think about is guys with guns, and looking at situations that involve guys with guns and use of force specifically, and situations that oftentimes do not. I'm sure Commissioner Harrington can talk about a lot of co-responder models or even direct response models, especially when it has to do with mental health. Sometimes it's to do with just, folks having an argument and having a violence interrupter. The Department of Public Safety has been a huge proponent and a supporter of different violence intervention programs that work alongside police as well. I know the NAACP has also been a huge proponent along that, about communities taking ownership of that. But I mean, I can get even to more fundamental questions of, because that to me raises the big question of timelines, and folks feel like, oh, well, this is super difficult and super, people expect the world to change. And I would like to say that the post board, I think, is a huge component here. Everyone knows that's kind of my hobby horse. There's a number of items they can do very quickly and very swiftly. But first, I actually just want to note that the post, before I get into any criticism, I do want to know the post board under their new leadership has revamped the use of force policy. They're moving on rulemaking, on data collection, and they're asked for an audit of themselves and are now looking at implementing those audit recommendations, which do look to address some of the issues that we're speaking about today. I would, however, I look at reimagining policing and I judge the boldness of folks' proposal based upon accountability and independence and tying those together. And what that means is from the point of complaint calls and enters into a specific police station, how many independent decision makers have the authority to either forward along that complaint for discipline or to make a decision for discipline. And what you find in the current system is most of the decision makers, either through culture or practice or policy and statute, and mostly policy and statute, there's no involvement of community whatsoever. And so, and there's a lot of discussions to be had around professional discipline for policing. But again, it would just, policing to me is a special profession, and I love to have a deeper conversation about this, but where that community deserves a voice at the table, a very strong voice at the table, to find, again, I think the big things are, a lot of folks talk about the deaths at the hand of the police, but a lot of discussion isn't had around the dehumanization and the disrespect police have on certain communities and how that builds up. And I think what you found is a lot of people who are marching in solidarity for Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's death didn't themselves know someone who was killed by police. But a lot of them knew someone who had an experience that was dehumanizing from police, and they felt as though there was no recourse. And so for me, reimagining policing is looking at how to build those systems so that there is a firm recourse, there's a firm sense of justice on both the end of the police and the end of the community. But I know I've taken up a lot of time. I have specific regulatory proposals I'd love to get into, but I'd love to give the floor to some other folks if possible.
Oh, I appreciate that. So, but thank you. So no, and I appreciate you giving us a little deeper dive. And, I wish we had 2 hours because this is a conversation you certainly can't do in 50 minutes. And I'm just going to take a real quick note. Jackie, if you're listening, we'll get a request to have some of the bios placed in for folks who came in late, or at least make them available after we finish this discussion. But I'm going to turn to Leslie, because Leslie was co-signing on what I was saying, because I saw the finger go up and the head start to nod. So I'm take yourself off.
I was feeling.
I saw it. Take yourself off mute and tell us what you're feeling.
So, this year was hectic, right? Obviously with COVID-19, with the global uprising, and, a huge burden has been put on the community, right? One, that we didn't create the problem, but now we're expected to create the solution, and not only create the solution, but to do it in a moment, right? Like not even, so when the whole defund the police concept came up, I understood what people were referring to, right? They were basically saying what exists in the suburbs should exist in the inner city, right? We should be able to pour money into education, into mental health services, into other areas, and not militarize the police, right? We should not have the 4th precinct in North Minneapolis instead of the way, right, which pours into the community. It's kind of like we have replaced community source resources and opportunities with policing, and that has not worked, right? But then on the flip side, recognizing that this idea of like just completely abolishing the police or getting rid of the police was something that people in North Minneapolis and people in the community, it was a very conflicted conversation. And I don't think that that rose to the surface enough, right? Because as you stated, if you're taking something away, you have to be giving something, right? And so for instance, when I organize Black men and Black women to protect North Minneapolis businesses that were being burnt to the ground, right? We had to work with Chief Arredondo, right? Like we had to work with the mayor's office. It's not one or the other, right? It's an opportunity of collaboration. And I told people, I think we have one of the best police chiefs in the nation. And so I will acknowledge that privilege that we had, because had that been another police chief that was not willing to cooperate and work, we would have had a completely different situation. And I want to give a lot of credit to protesters from Jamar Clark, right? Because I tell people it didn't start with George Floyd. There had been a movement, right? That's why I believe we have our first African-American Attorney General, Keith Ellison. I think that's why we have our first police chief, African-American police chief, Chief Arredondo. That's why we saw a transformation in city council. What I hope will happen is that we allow the voices of the masses and people who are most impacted by policing and by crime. And, you know, Representative Ayanna Pressley, she says it so perfectly. The people closest to the harm should be closest to the solutions, right? And that's what I'm big on, is not just having these theoretical conversations or outside people pushing agendas that sound good, right? But us to actually meaningfully really deal with this, because we have a real opportunity right now. For me, I believe Black people have still been in bondage and are in bondage in America. And I do believe that police plays a significant role, but not the only role to it. And we have a real opportunity to help Black people reach freedom and liberation, and we shouldn't play with it, because similar to the 13th Amendment, where we theoretically abolished slavery, but created a caveat and said, except if you're duly convicted of a crime, and now we see a mass incarceration of the descendants of those same people. I'm not willing to play those games anymore, right? And so if we're really talking about real change and real transformation, then let's do that, because people's lives are on the line.
And thank you for that. And I'm going to continue on that same, let me take myself off mute. I'm going to continue on that same vein with you, John. And I'm also going to sort of add in a question from Todd, not specifically to what he's saying, but in that same space. So, there's a moment, an opportunity here. And I don't think it's just a moment where communities been reactivated, not newly, but reactivated. And so one of the things that we heard coming in this election that just passed was really about defunding the police. And there was a pushback. There was a big pushback from voters about this notion of defunding. And specifically those folks who are avid supporters, and you don't have to make that choice. I think it's a false choice that you either choose police or you don't. But I think that one of the things we have to talk about is shared language and shared goals and visions. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? I sprinkled a lot of things in there, but it is about how we approach this, what language we use, what's our understanding. And we see that there is quite a divide in regards to what's being asked and what may or may not be delivered.
And I think you're right that there is a divide, but I think the divide is artificial. It's partly a divide of the possible versus the unimagined. So what is it that the community wants? And I think there's a certain level of pessimism about the bar that they can ever expect to achieve. So for example, if the only thing you've ever known is, a certain level of criminality in your city, you expect that that's just the norm. But why? Why is that the norm? If you move to Edina, one of our tonier Hennepin County suburbs, you probably don't go there expecting that there's a certain level of criminality in the neighborhood. You move there because you think that's not going to be the case. I don't know why we don't imagine a community where, aside from, there are some things that we cannot probably control, but where we are not committed to the idea that we're going to control those things that we know are coming. But part of the challenge with this is, it will take time, frankly. I talked to the chief Wasaki over in Camden. He said it took them 4 to 5 years before they actually got to what they wanted in Camden, in part because it took time to hire the right people with the right value system. They had to hire cops that love the community more than the concept of driving fast and playing cops and robbers. They had to hire people from the community that wanted good things to happen in that community. And you can't do that, frankly. Number one, you can't do it fast, because if you do, you're going to miss some things on the background. You're going to miss some things there. And then secondly, he said one of the things that was a big challenge for them was, how do you train these people to continue that? Because the history of policing has been, you send them through the academy, you send them through de-escalation, you send them through implicit bias training. And the day you graduate from the academy, some salty old cop tells you, kid, forget all that stuff. I'm going to tell you how to survive out in the streets. And because you're a little bit scared about what you're about to walk into, you do start to dismiss all of the guardian training that you had in the academy and replace it with a warrior mentality. And so Wasaki said one of the things that took them a while to do was, how do you train on the streets to continue to have people that love the community? He said, and I think we're actually at an opportune moment here right now. It's in some regards, it is similar to Camden. Camden lost all their cops because they got defunded by Governor Christie. So they went down from like 300 cops down to like 100 cops. That 100 cops were the cops that love the community. That 100 cops had to train the other 200 cops that came in to support that. And one of the things, because they were short of staff, they had an opportunity to build in big cadres of people. Minneapolis is short anywhere from 150 to 200 cops, depending on who you listen to. This is an opportunity for Minneapolis in particular to bring in 200 community-loving people who want the best for the community, and to train them right, and then to reinforce and support them as they continue their journey from recruit through academy onto the streets, where they're actually going to be able to really live the lifestyle of a community police officer, where they're part of the community. In Peel's world, you're not separate from the community, you're simply a part of the community, that you work with the public to create public safety.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to turn to just a few questions, but I'm going to ask if for Jamael and Leslie, if you could put a little bit of your bio into the chat. I think that would be great. I think Sadia is trying to help us get that because folks are asking. Carly brings up also a really good point in regards to narratives built up around models that we know are working, that often folks are in community settings or convenings and meetings about what do we want public safety to look like, and there doesn't seem to be an appetite for wanting to hear about what is working. And so I just want to make sure that I lift that up as well. And the question is, what are the things, if any, can we do about that? And Jamael, I'm going to let you answer to that. So we have models, we have things that we know show promise. And the question becomes one of, there's a level of exhaustion, I believe, but I would like you to answer that question about why folks are not really in the listening mood about what's out there and what may show promise.
Well, I guess I'm going to try to navigate this in a politically sensitive way. For me, there are clear things that do work that we have not implemented. And they are things, for instance, like integrity violations as a post-board policy, hate rhetoric being banned at a licensing level, holding CLEOs accountable for systemic model policy violations. And I know that sounds a bunch of jargon, but that's the chief law enforcement officer. If there are model policies put forth by the state that the state expects everyone to do, and there is a systemic violation of those policies, the chief law enforcement officer is never held accountable for those systemic violations. This is basic accountability. Duty to intervene and duty to report. Currently, through statute, we were only able to tie those to use of force. However, they should just be a requirement generally. We all know that on a licensure level, not just on an independent individual, department level. And then again, transparency, data tracking. There's a really great work. I know specifically, I know the commissioner cited Camden. They did very great data tracking work. We know that works, and I do think the post board is moving on that currently, and actually have a lot of confidence in them on moving on the data tracking component, the training component, both pre-service and continuing education training. I think they're going to do incredible work. However, I think there's wisdom in bringing folks like Leslie, or now our current president, Angela, and the NAACP, community folks to the table. Because one thing I know the post-board and police struggle with is, again, giving an independent, either a citizen review board, giving a human rights department, giving another body that's non-law enforcement the ability to discipline and the ability to hold officers accountable in some way through the process. They don't have to necessarily be the decision maker, but they could be deciding, they could be investigating, they could be, once the decision made, implementing the consequences, or deciding the consequences. Whatever the case is, injecting that independent voice into how we'd like to see police perform is, I think, is super important, and it requires outside voices pushing folks to have those things done. So there are a lot of solutions that I think we can do tomorrow, right? We can require that every complaint that you call a police officer is shared with the citizen review board, so they can investigate it, right? That the citizen review board don't have to request every complaint, that they can just get a complaint as it comes in. There are small and big things that we can do, but I think it never happens at the post board level for state policy specifically, and even at the city level in Minneapolis, without a strong citizen voice at the table, pushing back against, again, the institutional prerogative that would rather have folks who know the tools of the trade regulate that trade. And that's an understandable impulse. However, I just don't think it's been working. So.
Understandable. And I would say check chat a little bit. Folks are wanting to know where those policies and where your thoughts are documented, so they can go in, and especially about Camden. I think there's a lot, if you Google Camden, there's a lot of stuff on Camden right now, and people are going back to look at it. I want to go to a couple of things that have come up since we started this conversation. And first is Isabella, and I'm taking these out of order. So Rachel, I haven't forgotten your tech question, but Isabella, Commissioner, is asking, right? So if Camden did this homegrown, find the folks that are committed to community, and stating that only 10%, I believe, in Minneapolis live in the city. And so are you advocating that residency, right? Because this is what's come up. We're talking about how do you find those people who are going to be different and serve in a different way?
And I do recommend residency, and I know that's complicated because I came on at a time in 1977 where residency was the norm for cities of the first class. So I came on, I moved to St. Paul. That was not an issue for me at all. About 4 or 5 years later, the state passed a law that says residency could no longer be required, and you had cops moved out of the city. And when I was chief of police, we had to come up with creative ways to entice people to live in the city. And we found that when we did get them to live in the city, we had great community policing success. Now, part of that was we worked with, for example, St. Paul Public Housing. We got free apartments in public housing so that we could have officers that could live in every public housing site in the state within the city of St. Paul. What we found was that invested them into the safety of those public housing areas. They became more accessible to the elders and those folks that live in public housing, who made them feel safer. And we saw crime in our public housing sites lower than the general crime rate in the city of St. Paul very quickly after we had cops move into this residential program. We have to think of creative ways to incentivize why you would want to live in the city, because I don't know that you're going to get a legislative fix where it's going to be required. But the other piece is I really do think there are great young men and women in the cities who would love to be cops or would love to work for a police department. They may not necessarily want to be cops. I get a lot of the kids that go through my classes who are great community advocates. They're great analysts. They would be great working with kids. They don't necessarily need a gun and a badge to do all of the things that we want them to do with the community. And I think that speaks to issues around like Mad Dads and Mother's Love and groups like that, which we have used very successful in the ambassadors in St. Paul to go out there and have direct contact with kids, direct contact with really high crime areas. And we've seen, once again, we've seen the crime level go down. We've seen complaints about policing go down, and we've seen violence go down where we've inserted those community assets into the mix.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to go to Rachel's question is really around what we call technology use in policing, Leslie, and this is for you. And she's speaking really about, predictive policing and using machine learning to sort of determine who gets to go where and not thinking about those other underlying issues that may also be drawing folks there. Talk to us about the community's perspective on the use of technology for policing, which also includes data democratization, right? So we talk about transparency, but what we don't often do is provide that raw data to community to be able to do their own analysis and to be able to do their own work. So talk to us a little bit about your thoughts on that, on the technology use of policing to do this type of work, and then the transparency or data democratization where community can get access without having to go through multiple requests to do their own analysis.
And thank you. I think that is key. One thing the community is constantly pushing for is transparency. What we know is that there are not a lot of brown and Black people actually analyzing the data right on the back end. And so we do need that raw data so that we can do our own thorough analysis. In reference to who's going where, I think that this is very important. I actually got called to a scene of an incident not too long ago with a Black man who had purchased a lemon from an auto mart in South Minneapolis. And there was a big incident and the police was called and I went in there to talk to him and he kicked me out and the police showed up again. And one of the police officers was super hostile. Like he walked over to us, putting on his gloves, like he's about to do an execution. He was very high energy. I was able to de-escalate the situation, but had I not been there, that could have been a situation that turned very bad, right? And one of the things I always say is that you should not even be in our community, right? Like there are certain people that just should never be in the Black community. You don't really want to be in the Black community. You're there very much so in a way of overseeing, right? And not overseeing in a good way, but like really overseeing a plantation mentality. And it could be very detrimental. We need to make sure that there are people in our community that care about our community, that have received proper training from our community, that have been able to build relationships. When we talk about models that work, I remember growing up in the inner city of Washington, D.C., right? Which I know is a very unique place where we had a majority Black population at one point. And you had so many Black officers, right? Like you had people who actually knew the community, who would walk around on feet. If you go to North Minneapolis, you almost never see an officer walking around on feet, right? And even when they are, it's such a negative energy and interaction. And I really want better for the city of Minneapolis. I want better for the state of Minnesota and all over the nation. And I remember us knowing police officers' names and they knowing our names and how different that interaction was versus when police officers were just pulling up on in their car and harassing young Black men and women, right? And so I think that all of that matters and that we have to be very intentional about it, and tracking the interactions that officers are having with community members is very important, because as you even see with a person like Officer Chauvin, Brother George Floyd was not the first incident that he had, right? And had the community had access to knowing exactly what's going on. And for community members who may be listening, filing complaints is very important, because a lot of the time our community, we are not taking advantage of the data, and the data is not always really articulating what's going on in our community. So I'll stop there, but the data is super important.
Thank you for that. And I'm gonna do a little deeper dive here, and I'm going to I want to go into some spaces here that, I know some of you may have to politically sort of dance around it, but you've been on panels before, so you know how this works. I want to talk about abolishing the police. There is a movement, and I don't need to try to legitimize. There is a strong movement around the need for police or no need for police. Talk to me about, if there are no police, and I'm not saying that that's not possible, or it is possible, but I think if we're going to say what John said, what are we looking for? What are we looking to do? What does that look like? Not just for the state of Minnesota, Minneapolis, but throughout the country. What does it look like? What would it look like? I'm gonna start, Leslie, with you, because I ended with you.
I actually really wanted to start, so I'm glad that you started with me, right? Because while I am a little hesitant about all the conversations that's been quickly had, because again, I don't want to ever set our community up for failure, I actually do see a day where we don't need police, right? But me, my imagination goes wide, because I see a day where we don't need prisons either. So nevertheless, I would see where the beloved community, right, that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King talked about. And that does require some assistance, right? Like, again, I believe that poverty is at the root of a lot of issues that exist within our community. And so when the Black community is given the proper resources to be able to support themselves, when we are put in a position to thrive, again, like I said, I really would love to see the 4th precinct not exist and for the way to come back, right? I would love to see more community resources, more Black people like myself to be planted in North Minneapolis communities. Because you imagine a world where you have Black lawyers and doctors and entrepreneurs and Black people and white people and whoever cares about Black people and cares about humanity planted in the community and pouring into the community. I think we need to be able to defend ourselves and patrol ourselves. But I think that everything that the community needs already exists within the community, right? The only problem is the resources are not there. We have to acknowledge, that's why the conversation about reparations is not disconnected from this conversation. When people have land, when people have opportunity, when people have hope, right? There are so many young people struggling from homelessness, right? We're not receiving a proper education. Conflict resolution is not even a thing, right? That we've been taught, and we don't even know how to interact with each other. And we have so many mental health issues, right? Like, none of these conversations are isolated. I believe that once we are really able to take a good chunk and a good fight at poverty, a lot of these issues are going to be solved. And in addition to that, I believe that we can start seeing community policing, right? Where community is responsible for community in a real meaningful way. And it doesn't mean that it's not organized, because even when I was organizing people in North Minneapolis, I had to tell them, like, you don't want to replicate the same negative behavior that you had, right? Because unfortunately, the concept of policing has become yell at people, tell them what to do, pull out your gun. And it's like, no, right? Like, people don't need people. Like, I'm big on customer service. I'm big on, like, does the community see a need for you? Are you actually servicing, or are you taking away? We were like helping young kids get home and transport, and making sure people have food and had housing. And like, that's what I see. It's like a real holistic approach that is created that actually services, right? Like, kind of like the mission, like protecting and serving, not property, not just white people, but all people. That's what I see.
And that's why I started with you, ma'am. John, same thing, abolitionism.
I do not see that. I don't see that as a possibility as it's currently configured. I would cite that it's not that I think that police should not change, because I really do think we have to change. But I think we're really talking about governance and what is the responsibility of the government. And the police have basically caught, anything that the government didn't know what else to do with, they gave it to the police department. And so the police department has never, you ask the average cop, your educational background, you ready to go in and solve persistent chronic mental illness? No, but that's who gets sent. Why do we get sent to this rather than mental health workers? That doesn't make any sense. A lot of the social conditions where we have crime are the result of the governance system that we're operating in, and the police simply are the group that works 24/7 and makes house calls to respond to those spots that are troubling for the community. And so unless we can envision a time where there won't be murders, where there won't be rapes, and where there won't be robberies, and unfortunately, I don't see that in the current milieu that we're operating in, I think there are still going to be need for peace officers, and I would distinguish them from police officers, because I really do think that's a different calling. If you think about what the original calling for police was, they were a non-militarized, less lethal social group that was supposed to help the community and prevent crime and reduce disorder. We have lost the focus of preventing crime and reducing disorder in that sweep toward, well, we now have to be the warriors. And I don't think that was part of the original vision for what peace officers were supposed to be. And I think if we're going to reform, reimagine police, we have to go back to where the original ideas were of the police being part of the public, that they were there to prevent bad things from happening, and that force was only to be used when you couldn't persuade, cajole, or talk people into things. I see force being used way too quickly by young people who don't realize that their mind is the tool that they were hired to use, that their voice and their passion and their heart was what we hired them for, not their ability to roll around on the ground or to use force.
And thank you for that. And that speaks to culture of training and a lot of other things that we don't have time to get into, but I want to go to Jamael on the same question. When we talk about abolitionism, abolishing the police.
Yes, I'm going to echo what Commissioner said, that, I mean, at present tense, the policy, I don't see it possibly being able to be implemented within our lifetimes. However, I have had really great discussions with during the development of the Posse Caucus bills as staff with a whole variety of folks, a lot of them who believe in defunding the police. And so I've gotten intimately familiar with how that public policy could come to be. And I think it's fair to represent their position as similar to Commissioner Harrington, that the institution of policing is sprawling. It has a culture and is more than just guys with guns with the authorization to use force on behalf of the state. It is more than that. And so there are fundamental questions that should be raised about what do these guys with guns currently do? And so, for instance, Mayor Majority did a very good study or a really good article on traffic stops, and it shows how the these high stakes traffic stops with searches are ineffective, they're discriminatory, and they oftentimes put police in danger. There's a really great, we keep talking about mental health. There isn't a specialized non-policing unit that is built to respond to emergency mental health situations that can co-respond with them. But that would be a way you would transform and get that out of the hands of these quote unquote guys with guns. Another one is crime clearance rates. All the investigators, all the detectives, all of the loss prevention folks, moving that to, again, a more administrative capacity. We have meter maids who are administrative agents oftentimes. Sometimes they are police, but oftentimes they're just administrative agents. And I know meter maids is insulting, but parking patrol, whatever the official name is. These folks work to ensure folks are following ordinance in a way that doesn't involve force. And in a world, and so with that said, there will still need to be a rapid response team for things like school shooting, bank robberies, and so forth, right? There's going to be people, there are school shootings in Columbine, which was a very nice suburban area with a whole bunch of, wealth and affluence. There needs to be a rapid response team for that. And that is not, at least if you're going to take the best version of the argument to defund the police, that rapid response team isn't what police are currently. Police are not highly trained specifically to use force with high accountability and only deployed in instances where force is absolutely needed. The police are something much bigger and much more complicated. And so wrestling with what police are and how you define that is a good entryway. And then how you deploy guys with guns and people who need force is a good entryway to begin to think about how you would create a world without this institution of policing. So.
Thank you for that. And touching on a couple of points, right? So it is not just the culture. I see you, Leslie. It's not just the culture. And it's not just, how do you make that change in what is the job? What is the community is asking this current group of law enforcement folks to do? Leslie, I want you to respond, and then only because we're short of time, I want to move into some governance, but please go ahead.
Thank you so much. First, I want to say this whole notion, and Jamael, I have so much love and respect for Jamael, but this notion of guys with guns is the exact problem, right? One, this system is very male oriented, right? And that's why I'm just gonna say, if women was more involved, amen, maybe we wouldn't have half the problems that we do have, right? But we don't have that current system right now. I also really want to humanize this, right? Because many of you on this call may feel comfortable with police. You may have to call police, and police have helped me too. And I have so many people in my family that are police officers. Yet every time I see police, I have extreme level of anxiety. I know that in the wrong interaction, I could be dead. And the wrong interaction could simply be a traffic stop. The wrong interaction could be, and my white colleagues and friends, they don't have that same anxiety, right? Like there's a real danger here that we don't talk about. The fact that Black people shouldn't have to worry about being murdered every time they get in their car or every time they walk down the street, right? And so when I talk about abolishing police in the future and how I see a world, it's because I see a world of freedom. I see a world of liberation. I see a world where I want to raise beautiful Black babies in. And so I have to see it in my lifetime.
Leslie, you're absolutely right on the statistics on female officers. Their use of force is less. Their de-escalation skills are better. There's a really great body of information that supports that. It has been tricky trying to get young women of color to join the police department, which is one of the things I was shocked. I grew up Southside Chicago, and there were sisters everywhere where I grew up. And I got here, and there was like Debbie Montgomery was the only sister that was doing policing, and trying to figure out how to make this job attractive to sisters and Latina and all the. But the statistics back you up on this, that if you walk into a situation thinking that you have to fight, which is sort of that testosterone fueled male perspective, oftentimes is not, you'll get what you expect. If you walk in thinking you can possibly de-escalate this, you can talk your way through it, you will get what you expect in that situation also.
And
I appreciate you.
I have an idea. I just want to let you know, Commissioner Harrington, I would love for you to reach out to me, and I would love for us to do coffee, because I have a solution. I never present a problem without a solution.
We got a coffee date.
I'm open to solutions. So.
Absolutely. I want to, because you both have talked about this, and we only have a few minutes left, I do want to roll into the issue of not just governance, but policing culture. Because with Leslie and both, but John, what you both have raised, if you want to be able to raise the numbers of women of color in policing, you're gonna have to deal with the culture. And I've had this conversation with lots of women of color who are in policing and chiefs positions as well. So it's not just the ground, it's those folks that are in leadership. That's a different time though. We'll get that one set up. I want to go into a little bit about, because Tay mentioned this early on around unions. When you talk about the need of governance, the need to have some type of response, peace officers versus really crime officers, if you think about it, who are really reacting to something different. What has to happen in governance? Because right now, and this is part of Tay's question, right, the unions in regards blocking any kind of reimagining work, accountability and discipline. So we'll do this sort of last round robin, because this will be our last one. Talk to us a little bit about, how do you approach unions, and what do you need to do in this governance sort of apparatus around accountability, whether it's state level and whether it's on the ground where all policing is local. So Leslie, I'm gonna go back to you because you started. And so she's like, don't even.
Don't start with me on this one. Come to me back.
All right. Jamael, you're grinning.
I'll jump in on this.
Who's first? You're gonna jump in? Awesome.
Yeah, no problem with that at all. One of the lessons
all right, Jamael, then you're after.
was when they changed over departments, the Police Benevolent Association, which used to be their union, was no longer the union for Camden, and they brought in a new union that was committed to community policing. Because of that, they adopted a community policing philosophy in terms of discipline. They adopted a community policing philosophy in terms of training, and a lot of the stuff that was the us versus them adversarial relationship between the traditional union and the police management dropped off when they were all committed to the same vision of what policing could look like. The other thing they talked about, and it struck me as odd because I came up through the civil service ranks, was they said civil service became the gatekeeper for keeping the status quo the way it was. And I remember when I came on, civil service was the way that we were going to protect you from draconian and capricious decisions by the chief. And they said, well, you couldn't get community policing through the Civil Service Commission in Camden. So I'm thinking there are ways to do this, but we're going to have a conversation at the front end with the union and say, are you committed to the vision of policing that the community that you serve wants? Because if you're not, then that becomes a real stumbling block to having any kind of a fruitful conversation about how do we implement this different vision of being peace officers versus being police officers.
Jamael?
Okay, so let me be a little controversial here. I think unions are paper tigers. I don't think unions have been given the ability, and not only unions, but the leadership of the Chiefs of Police Association and leadership of the Sheriff's Association have been given the ability to negotiate human rights, right? Human rights is not a labor dispute, right? And we have given them the ability to negotiate human rights because we have not, in a strong licensing way, defined practices and procedures to regulate out human rights abuses. If you look across the state, there is a disproportionate use of force against people of color. And while, again, I got to repeatedly lift up our current post board because they are moving. But there's a number of items which I will be working with the NAACP and specifically under Dr. Raj to advance, hopefully through the post board, that can be done immediately. I do think it's super, unions have an influence. They certainly do. I very much feel, though, that if you put into state licensing and state statute firm regulations and accountability measures, the degree to which, and you also then involve, and through you involve other decision-making bodies, for instance, a civilian review board, empower them, allow them to work both alongside the chief, but also give them authority over the chief in some circumstances, then unions will serve their proper role, which is not defining human rights for the residents of a specific city, but it's to define labor agreements, right? And I know sometimes those things are blurred lines, but most of the time they really aren't. And if you look at the way the chiefs pursue arbitrations, oftentimes they don't pursue them. And when you look at, if you talk with unions, they'll tell you most of the time they lose is because the case isn't put together well, or the chief or the sheriff violated the collective bargaining, right? And I'm not saying I believe in unions, and I'm not saying unions aren't an impediment. What I am saying, though, is at the state regulatory body, they do not dominate the state regulatory body, and yet the state regulatory body does not act to ensure, for instance, white supremacist armed police, that every officer has a duty to intercede and report, that every single complaint, whether validated or not, makes its way to a civilian oversight panel. There's a number of items that can be done that can defang unions when it comes to the discussion of human rights. So
thank you for that. And Leslie, I'm going to have you close this out. And while you do that, I'm going to thank you all for sticking with us just a few extra minutes. Ms. Leslie, bring us home.
Thank you. I wanted to go last because this is such a sad topic for me, right? This is not a topic that energizes me at all, specifically with the Minneapolis Union. You all know the struggles that we had with that. And I'm thanking God that I don't have to speak on behalf of anybody but myself right now. The reality of it is when you have the union president standing on the stage with President Trump, and when you have most police departments pouring in and endorsing President Trump, where we know that where he stands when it comes to white supremacists, where he stands where it comes to to Black people, lives being lost, right? It speaks volumes, and the fact that police officers are pouring into these unions, right? It's a clear indicator on who is servicing our communities. And it disheartens me, right? Of like how far we haven't come. But I will say my hope is, because I think Commissioner Harrington and Jamael hit a number of the points. So I'm constantly saying we have to really touch the hearts and the minds of people, right? And I think that there are real conversations in education, right? Despite what the former President Trump said, education does matter, right? Like diversity training, it does matter because communities are more divided than they've ever been before. And I believe that the union can play a better role in actually helping to unite versus cause this division. And as Jamael said, trying to define human rights and speaking against the Black community. And for those of you who might not know what I'm talking about, President Bob Kroll has called Jamar Clark a thug numerous times. He said that he didn't think anything was wrong in Eric Gardner case in New York City. He's spoken out very publicly against the Black community and the brutality that we are facing in America, and recognizing, for anyone who's on this call, Black Lives Matter is not a political statement. And if it's political to you, that means that our humanity is too, right? And so this is really not a joke. This is really not a game. And Black people's lives are really on the line. And so if you care about humanity, if you care about the human race, I ask that you stand with us in a real way. And you know what I like to say, don't complain, activate.
Thank you. And that is the fabulous way to end. And thank our panelists, Leslie and John and Jamael, as always. Keep doing the work that you're doing. Keep the conversation going, keep the work going, be about more than just about talk. So thank you so much. And we will make sure we get everybody on to the next as well. And I'll see you all soon. So thank you so much. Appreciate you all.